Behavioural economics on a post-it number 7, the endowment effect. This is the sort of observation that's been empirically observed. I'll talk a little bit about one of the probably the most famous study on the endowment effect in a moment. But it's the observation that people, once they own a particular thing, they seem to place a lot more value upon that thing than they would have expressed before they owned that particular thing, right? So people become attached in some sense, it seems, to things that are given to them, and it can be really very trivial things. I mean, you can think about this yourselves. You might have, I don't know, a pencil or a pen that you particularly like, and if somebody were to ask you how much you would need to be paid in order to sell that pen, it might be a lot higher than you would have ever been willing to pay for that pen before you owned it. Right? Now, again, as with most of the, I think as with almost all of the behavioural economic findings, I think that these phenomena were sort of intuitively known to exist before behavioural economists and behavioural psychologists empirically observed them in many cases. I remember, and when you read works of literature, you can notice the sort of what are essentially the behavioural economic findings being discussed, very regularly in general literature. I remember reading, I think it was Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, and there's one of the main characters in it is a sort of newspaper proprietor. I think he's based on William Randolph Hearst, actually. And he talks about an ashtray, a very trivial object to him, compared to his enormous wealth, and how he sort of muses about. I can't really understand that once he owned that particular ashtray, he seemed to value it enormously, much more than he would ever thought about valuing just a simple ashtray before he had ever owned it. And the character owns many great works of art and all sorts of very expensive items in the book, and yet it's this ashtray that he seems to value very, very highly once he's actually owned it. Now, in terms of the empirical observations, I suppose, of the endowment effect, Richard Thaler, who is a famous behavioural economist, one of the founding fathers of modern behavioural economics, he wrote a paper, I think, with Daniel Kahneman, if I remember rightly, and other colleagues. I think they wrote it in the early 1980s, if I remember rightly. And they looked at the endowment effect in relation to coffee mugs, I think, or coffee cups, coffee mugs. And they had a selection of respondents whom they gave the mugs to, and asked them how much they would be willing to sell those mugs for. What's the minimum price that they would accept in order to sell their mugs? And they had another sample of respondents who were asked how much they would be willing to buy those same rather simple coffee cups for, coffee mugs for. And what they found was that though the price that people were willing to pay for these coffee cups was roughly half as much as the price that other groups of people would require in order to sell the coffee cup. That is to say, the willingness to sell was roughly twice as much as the willingness to pay for these coffee mugs. If I can remember rightly, I think it was a roughly $3.50 versus roughly $7. Right. Now that's significant. Well, in many ways, I suppose, but it's significant because it relates almost directly to what we talked about in terms of loss aversion. Once people own something, maybe giving that thing up is perceived in their own mind psychologically as a loss in some sense, whereas paying for that thing to begin with could be considered to be, getting that thing to begin with could be considered to be a gain, right? And because people value losses much more, it seems, in many instances, than they do gains of the same magnitude, then that might be a reason for why people want much more money to lose the coffee cup than they would ever be willing to pay to gain that same coffee cup. Right. So just on that note, I don't think I mentioned this in the previous post-it on loss aversion, but the loss aversion, what's called the loss aversion parameter, is roughly observed to be, in many instances, around about 2. That is to say that losses are weighted roughly twice as much as gains of the same magnitude. And that's what Thaler, Kahneman et al. Found in their famous coffee cup experiment. So as I said a moment ago, as I said here, that is, willingness to accept is often much greater than the willingness to pay for a particular thing. That can have all sorts of policy implications. I talked about some of the policy implications of loss aversion in previous post-its. But you could think about this in relation to investing and disinvesting in public policy programs or public sector programs. And I believe that Adam Smith did allude to this as well. Adam Smith, as I said, the founding father of economics, at least in the English-speaking world, alluded to this phenomenon that people find it much more difficult, perhaps, to disinvest in public programs than they would ever, spend money on to invest in those programs to begin with. Because once a program is already up and running, people might consider the dismantling of that program as a loss, and therefore may be very resistant to losing that program. This has implications for all sorts of public policy programs, of course, all public policy investments potentially, but it plays out perhaps in considerations of whether countries should disinvest or invest in particular healthcare programs in their healthcare systems. So many countries now, at least as one input into decision making around whether to invest or disinvest in a healthcare system, or it's a healthcare service or a healthcare intervention, they consider the cost effectiveness or value for money for that intervention. And people might be generally very resistant to disinvest in interventions that represent not very good value for money because, perhaps, of their propensity towards loss aversion. Losing that particular healthcare intervention may play much more strongly in their minds once that program has been implemented than their consideration that they might have had for ever investing in that particular healthcare intervention before it was ever sort of publicly provided. Right, so that disjoint, if you like, between willingness to accept and willingness to pay, that may be caused by loss aversion, largely, is something that's not really picked up at all, hardly at all, in standard economic theory. And yet it's a very important and prominent observation in the history of behavioural economics.